Hey, Dr. Mike Scheeringa here. In this video, I'll explain complex PTSD and how it's a narrative about one of the most extraordinary disinformation campaigns in the history of psychiatry. Complex PTSD is not a real disorder, yet it's been officially recognized and embraced as fact by clinicians, professional organizations, and many major governmental agencies that deal with children and disadvantaged populations. It's important to talk about the complex PTSD movement because, number one, patients are getting labeled with a disorder that isn't real. Number two, therapists are spreading a myth that certain types of patients need a special type of treatment protocol that's longer and more complicated. And three, most importantly, complex PTSD is at its core an ideology that spreads falsehoods about the fundamental nature of humans, in the sense that complex PTSD tries to redefine personality disorders and disparities among disadvantaged populations as being caused by nurture, not nature. A subgroup of activist scientists and clinicians are using complex PTSD to massively redefine the concept of mental illness in the world. This is a battle for the profession of mental health, and whether it's going to be a playground of weaponized theories for ideology wars, or a medical field that's based on science and truth. In the first part of this video, I'll explain what complex PTSD is and how it differs from regular PTSD. I'll explain how it was invented by activist doctors. In the second part, I'll explain the research on it and why I and others have spoken out on why it's not true. Stay tuned to the end and I'll give my interpretation of how and why this false disorder became so popular and how it's the outgrowth of an ideology, not science. This is a disclaimer that I'm not giving medical advice. I'm simply providing education about terms used in psychiatry and mental health fields. So in part one, I describe complex PTSD, or at least what its supporters allege it is. Complex PTSD is not a scientifically supported construct. It was invented out of the blue in 1992 with an article by a psychiatrist in Boston named Judith Herman. The stressor criterion of complex PTSD is very different from regular PTSD. Number one, complex PTSD focused on repeated and prolonged events, whereas regular PTSD covers all types of trauma. And secondly, the trauma criterion in regular PTSD is life-threatening. In complex PTSD, this was broadened enormously from a life-threatening trauma to trauma plus constant, prolonged, and repeated stress, and maybe just constant stress with no life-threatening events at all. These include time spent in prison, concentration camps, coerced prostitution, and chronic child abuse. Complex PTSD is also different because it covers a wide array of symptoms. Complex PTSD expanded the types of symptoms it covers way beyond the symptoms of PTSD by adding a vast array of symptoms about attachment, difficulty with interpersonal relationships, and emotional dysregulation. These new symptoms look like symptoms we typically see in personality disorders, not trauma victims. A key feature of nearly every piece of writing and lecturing on complex PTSD is an undercurrent of morality. The supporters claim that we must recognize complex PTSD out of a moral obligation to help horribly victimized people. The supporters also frequently claim that clinicians who fail to recognize complex PTSD are harming these patients by giving them the wrong treatments. That's a fascinating aspect of the whole complex PTSD movement. I don't think there has been any disorder in the history of psychiatry or medicine in general where moral shaming of non-believers has been so extreme. We'll come back to this in part 3. When Herman and her supporters tried to get complex PTSD recognized in the DSM, the official taxonomy of psychiatry, in 1994, complex PTSD was rejected because of a lack of validity evidence. Complex PTSD was then rebooted as a childhood disorder and called developmental trauma disorder in 2005 by a doctor named Bessel van der Kolk and others. When the official taxonomy of DSM was next revised in 2013, they tried to get this disorder into the manual and it was rejected again for lack of evidence. But then something remarkable happened and it was accepted by a different taxonomy called the ICD-11 in 2019. The ICD accepted complex PTSD despite the lack of evidence because ICD is a substantially different type of taxonomy than the DSM, and the ICD developers apparently weighed the popularity of complex PTSD far more than the scientific data. Now in part 2, I explained the research, or rather the lack of research, to support complex PTSD. When trying to prove that a new disorder exists in psychiatry or any field of medicine, it always has to start with case reports. After showing that there are real individuals who have a disorder, then you move up to more sophisticated and expensive group studies. There's not a single case report in the world that shows complex PTSD is valid. A case report is important because it shows all the clinical things you need to show, the time course of the events and the development of symptoms, and hopefully whether treatment is appropriate from regular treatments or whether new treatments are needed that signals maybe it's a new type of disorder. These figures explain why showing the time course for the development of symptoms is so important. Nearly all of the research on validity that supporters of complex PTSD have produced are cross-sectional studies. This next series of figures illustrate the problem with cross-sectional studies and how they violate the principle of exchangeability. This figure describes two hypothetical individuals. The patient in the top row fits the complex PTSD theory. The person was initially normal with no problems, then experienced prolonged and repeated trauma, and this caused a vast array of symptoms. The patient in the bottom row already possessed interpersonal and dysregulation problems before experiencing trauma. When they experience trauma, then this adds the PTSD symptoms for the person in the bottom row. If you described these two patients at only time 2 on the right side of the figure, they both look the same, but it should be obvious that the cause of their symptoms are very different. The only way to know the truth, whether it's the top row or the bottom row, is to examine both patients at both time 1 and time 2. And as I said, there are no case studies in the world that have done that and been able to support the complex PTSD theory. I believe the evidence is pretty strong that individuals born with these emotional dysregulation and interpersonal problems are made that way at birth, probably through genetics, rather than by their experiences. These types of individuals tend to live in situations of chaos and instability, which makes it more likely they will become the victims of prolonged and repeated trauma experience. Trauma does not happen at random. So if complex PTSD doesn't explain why patients have regular PTSD symptoms plus affect and emotional dysregulation problems, who are these patients and how should they be diagnosed? They should be diagnosed as PTSD plus borderline personality disorder, or at least features of borderline personality disorder or some other types of personality disorders. Critics of complex PTSD have been saying this for a long time. In response to this criticism, supporters of complex PTSD have gone to great lengths to publish bizarre studies to try to convince us that patients with complex PTSD are different from patients with borderline personality disorder. That, however, is not the relevant issue. The relevant issue is that complex PTSD covers such a wide range of different symptoms that it overlaps with borderline personality disorder. Supporters of complex PTSD generally refuse this as even a possibility. Despite these rejections, a small group of researchers have kept publishing and promoting relentlessly. I've discussed only a few of the problems with the research on complex PTSD, and it would take several hours to go through all of the problems with the research and their twisted logic, because the supporters of complex PTSD have excelled at publishing a ton of studies that are full of misdirections and flaws. This figure shows 9 other arguments that they commonly make. I've debunked all of these arguments in an unpublished document. I've posted it on my personal website at scheeringa.com under the Books tab if you're interested in more details. Now, in part 3, I give my interpretation of how complex PTSD went from a fake disorder that was invented out of thin air based on an ideology to becoming enormously popular and embraced as fact by trauma experts and important government agencies. The fundamental appeal of complex PTSD is moral, not scientific. To believe in complex PTSD is to believe in a mission to save weaker, disadvantaged people after they've been victims of stronger perpetrators. By supporting this mission, the believer is imbued with a higher moral status. That is the true and only value of complex PTSD. This next series of figures shows the process of mental mechanisms that I believe explains why supporters believe in complex PTSD. I call this the road to Traumaville. The process is not about achieving any end goal that helps patients. The process is to have something to fight for every day to elevate one's moral status. It's a never-ending road because if the supporters ever achieved all of their agenda, they would have to find something else to fight for. The road to Traumaville starts every morning when we wake up and look in the bathroom mirror and ask ourselves this: am I a good person? We all experience this. Much of the time, for most of us, the answer is, I don't feel good about myself, or at least, I wish I felt better about myself. That's just a facet of human nature to drive us to be better, competent individuals. Those of us who have a broad moral foundation and care deeply about many different issues can usually convince themselves to feel good many different ways. But when researchers or clinicians with skewed moral foundations focus excessively on one moral foundation, caring for victims and the disadvantaged, they have only one main avenue to feel better. They have to fight for victims and disadvantaged people. Furthermore, a way to maximize their self-inflation and moral status is to not fight for just any old victim. They can opt to fight for the most horribly victimized and most massively disadvantaged groups of people who have been beaten down by stronger forces. The worse the problems are for the victims, the more worth the clinicians and researchers can derive from the fighting. One way to have worse problems is to have a personality disorder, because those have been shown to be largely genetic, permanent dysfunctions that are pretty resistant to treatment. Other ways are to be drug users and violent criminals. All of these things are covered under complex PTSD in the literature. This process of moral self-inflation naturally gets extended to debates with other professional colleagues. Supporters of complex PTSD have mastered the art of moral shaming those who don't agree with them by claiming that clinicians who don't believe in complex PTSD are harming patients with the wrong treatments. I call this the moral status seesaw. When supporters shame others, it inflates their moral status in their own minds while simultaneously lowering the moral status of their opponents. Through this process of the road to Traumaville, individuals feel better about themselves as moral human beings with a mission-driven life path that never runs out of material. Mission accomplished. Note that the point for these activists is not to extract any scientific truths or improve any patient's lives. The point is to always be fighting for victims. Greater moral status is the reward. These activists are swinging away in an ideology war, and they seem to be only dimly aware of it. It's a clever trick that individuals have mastered in other arenas, and I describe several others in my book, including the case of Elizabeth Holmes and the criminal fraud of her Theranos company, and the Bush administration that managed to persuade Americans that Iraq was building weapons of mass destruction and the country should be invaded. To emphasize my main point, the motive driving activists to promote the idea of complex PTSD is the need for moral status. They feel driven to self-inflation and to enhance their moral status by fighting for victimhood. The drive for self-inflation and wanting to be a moral person are generally good qualities. They're great qualities because they make us productive people who are competent and can be relied on in social groups. But in the modern world, when a subgroup of morally skewed individuals try to grapple with complicated problems, those values are easily subverted. That's all for now. Comments are always welcome. If you found this helpful, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to my channel.